I want to begin this morning with a review of the book. I slightly modified the general structure of the book to reflect kind of what we've been learning and how it's organized. In the beginning was the instruction, then the next section of the book was the 4 series of sevens, which have finished, actually. We had the 7 letters of the church, and then in between that, before the 7 seals, we had the heavenly throne room scene. After the 7 seals were the 7 trumpets. And right after the 7 trumpets, before the 7 bowls, we had the section of chapter 12 through 14, which is the dragon and the lamb, which was divided into 3. The attacks of the dragon, the instruments of the dragon being the Antichrist and the false prophet. And then it switched over to the lamb, which showed his victory, the warnings on the earth, and then the harvest of the end. That's all before the 7 bowls. And if you remember in 15 and 16, it used language that connected right to the 7th trumpet to know that it's continuation. And then after the 7 bowls, we are now in another section that breaks. It stops the chronology to give us more information before we get to the chapter 19, which will be the final triumph of God. In the bowls, he was pouring out God's wrath. And it's his full wrath. So in 19, we see his coming back. And his coming back is part of that because that's where he judges the world. So until we get to the end of chapter 18, 17 and 18 will be a section that doesn't continue the narrative, but it helps explain what's going on. These 2 chapters, it personifies Babylon as a harlot. And Babylon itself is a metaphor. So we'll get into that as far as what that means. And this is really in contrast to the bride of Christ, the bride of the Lamb, which we're going to be introduced to in chapter 19. And some of the language that's used there is parallel. And it's repeated to make a distinction between the two. The bride of the Lamb is in chapter 19 and chapter 21. But specifically, last time, when we talked about the 6th plague in chapter 16 and the 7th plague, the 6th plague was that the Euphrates River was dried up, and that was this big river here, and that's in order for the kings of the east to be able to come across in order to attack Jerusalem. So the circumstances allowed for Satan's demons to go out, which the text said they went out in the appearance of a frog, which was an unclean, associated with evil creatures, to bring the different nations against the Antichrist nations to do war. So these are all people that are not saved, but Satan is bringing them together and divided in order to bring about the destruction of all life. And we saw that in Matthew 24. Jesus said he was going to stop it, and he had to stop it. He had to cut those days short, or all life would have been lost. And that would be Satan's ultimate goal, is your death, is your destruction. And he wanted to stop Christ from coming back to have a people to rule over as king. Then in the 7th plague, we saw, that was the last plague, we saw great earthquakes that levels the earth except for Mount Zion, and we had great hailstorms. Now the great earthquakes, just to give a secondary level or secondary note, I was reading this week in Zephaniah where it talks about figuratively the kingdoms being leveled out into a plain with only one mountain remaining, which is Zion, showing the height and the strength of it would cover the whole world. I think that will be literal, but it will also have that figurative sense, which is it's the only place, the only mountain to rule the whole world will be Mount Zion, Jerusalem, where Jesus will rule in his millennial kingdom. Okay, now specifically, looking back in Revelation 16:16, it said, and they gathered together to the place which in Hebrew is called Harmageddon, which most translations have Armageddon, and that's the 6th seal. And so that talks about the Antichrist who is there in Jerusalem and the rest of the nations that are coming in. This is just a different map than last week, and you can see the kind of the plain where this is talking about. But we also looked at other passages that it said it's going to be along the mountains as well, or surrounding Jerusalem. And in chapter 16, verse 19, it says, Babylon the Great was remembered before God, and to give her the cup of the wine of his fierce wrath. And that's in the 7th bowl. So we know Babylon is there and is remembered, her crimes are remembered by God, and she will be punished in the seventh seal. And in the sixth seal, remember the Euphrates River is dried up in order that that army could come in. So that army is coming in during the seventh seal. They are here now. The seventh bowl, the seventh plague is being poured out. So now, this is two different times where these people, Babylon, is being referenced. And we actually saw Babylon being referenced early in Revelation, which we'll get to a little bit later. But nothing more is told about Babylon and what that is, Babylon the Great. So now in these two chapters, we start to get a detailed vision about Babylon the Great and her fall. But this week, in chapter 17, verses 1 through 15, we're going to see the vision of the great harlot. So I want to begin with the first part of that vision, which is the introduction, the invitation, to see the judgment of the great harlot, verses 1 and 2. Let's read that passage. It says, Then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and spoke with me, saying, Come here, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on the many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed acts of immorality. And those who dwell on the earth were made drunk with the wine of her immorality. Well, the first thing we see is this is one of the seven angels that had the bowls. It's a mighty angel, very powerful, and thus by that angel coming to John, it connects what he's seeing with the bowl judgments, and specifically here, where Babylon the Great is mentioned. As we just read, it's mentioned at the end in the seventh plague. So the angel is now going to explain to John who that is. What is the great harlot, the great Babylon? And if you notice, how does he present it? Come here and I will show you the judgment. This is a punishment. This whole vision and the explanation is all framed in judgment of this worldwide system. And she's personified as a woman, but not just any woman, a harlot, a prostitute. And in biblical language, prostitutes or harlotry is used as a metaphor for peoples or nations that are seeking security and wealth apart from God. They sacrifice their morality for personal gain and bringing damaging results upon their victims. It's usually people who are weak and vulnerable. And a harlot will draw upon those weak and vulnerable people, drawing humanity's desire and love away from God and towards false gods, false idols. So, when he talks about the great harlot, it's talking about people who are engaged in a false religion. And it's personally motivated for gain, for either power, success, money, material, so on and so forth. And look how she's described. She's described as the great harlot. Well, if she's great, it means that she's very successful, and her reach is worldwide. In these two verses, the angel introduces to John what he's about to see. He doesn't see any of this yet. But the angel, because he's describing this vision, he's already casted this woman in a negative sense. He's going to be judged. She's described as a prostitute, and she's making people drunk, all of which connote strong desires, strong influence, lust, things that are not pure, not right, but sinful. Okay, so these symbols, these images, are going to be pointing to a particular reality. And that reality is going to be a worldwide false religious system. So that's the introduction. In the invitation of the angel to see the judgment of the great harlot. Verses 3 and 6 is the vision that John sees of the great harlot. Verse 3 says, and he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. Now we've seen this already when it talks about in the spirit being carried away. He's referring to his experience of that transcends the bounds of normal human apprehension and senses. He's having a trance, but he's being transported to a different location than where he was. And even in these trances, he still describes them and experiences them through his human senses. He sees, he hears, he feels, but they didn't walk there. They traveled in different means than normal human experience could do. And where did they go? They went into a wilderness. Now, wilderness doesn't necessarily mean a desert. It can be very lush as far as vegetation is concerned, but the point of it is it's an isolated region. And it really shows that this is away from God's temple, away from God, and away from the company of his angels. This is somewhere else. And John is there in a wilderness region and looking out over the waters. And this woman is sitting over the waters, sitting on a scarlet beast and full of blasphemous names and over waters. The sitting on the beast, it reflects that she's dwelling. The word for sitting literally just means sitting, but it has a metaphorical meaning that can mean to reign and rule, but that's not what it means in this context, as we'll see later on. What it means is to dwell, to live, to reside there. So it shows that the Antichrist, his empire, which is symbolic of, the beast is symbolic of, she is going to be living in it, among the people. She's going to be dwelling there. And the beast upon which she's sitting, its description matches the Antichrist's description, which we saw in chapter 13. In chapter 13, verse 1, it says, "The dragon stood on the sands of the seashore. Then I saw a beast coming up out of the sea," that's where we are, "having 10 horns and 7 heads, and on his horns were 10 diadems, and on his heads were blasphemous names." So you can see all the boxes have the same wording. It's that repetition that's on purpose to make that identity clear to you, that we're talking about the Antichrist and his empire. And remember, the 7 heads and the 10 horns are also the same description that's used of the dragon in chapter 12, verse 3. But the rest of the description specifically referred to the beast. The dragon refers to Satan, and we would expect Satan's instrument, the Antichrist, to be and look like him. The unique description, though, in chapter 17 is that the dragon is scarlet. We know the dragon was red, but earlier in chapter 13, the beast was never described as being scarlet. But it simply means sin. It refers to, just like the dragon, sin. Just like in Isaiah 1:18, where it says, "Although your sins are like scarlet, I will make them white as snow." It's the same kind of connotation. So here in this verse here, where he carried me away, and he saw the woman sitting on the scarlet beast, full of blasphemous names. Blasphemous names meaning he's claiming to be God, and had the other names of God, which he is not. So if you think about all the names, the Counselor, the Shepherd, the Prince of Peace, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, those kinds of things which only God can be called, only Christ can be called in those names, the Antichrist is saying that of himself. Blasphemous names, the 7 heads and 10 horns. This gives us a bird's eye view of the connection of the beast and the harlot. They are connected, and yet they're distinct. They're two things. The beast is always described in male terms and as a beast itself, and the harlot is as a woman, a prostitute, and as we'll see later on, the beast actually turns against her and devours her and hates her. So the woman, when we see the woman description in these 2 chapters, we always see her in conjunction with the beast, either being supported by, sitting, dwelling among, or later being destroyed in verse 16 of the 17th chapter. So now we know that the beast is connected with the harlot. So now John focuses on the harlot herself. In verse 4 it says, "The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and of the unclean things of her immorality." Now, purple in antiquity was a color that symbolized status and particularly royalty. It was actually made from shellfish. And then scarlet was not royal, but it was a status of wealth and prosperity. And that was actually made from insects that were crushed. So right off the bat, she's clothed in colors of royalty, of strength, of wealth, of prosperity. And then she's adorned with gold, precious stones, and pearls. She's dressed to attract, showing and flaunting her wealth. Her extravagance with all of these jewels and gold, it shows her success as a prostitute among the nations, and thus the devotion of her followers that will give her everything. It's a crude metaphor that describes their following and their passion for this false religion, this false system. And she has a golden cup, again, wealth. Not many people drink out of gold cups. She has a gold cup that's full of abominations. The word for abominations there means that which is detestable in God's sight. It's totally defiling. What must not be brought before God, or it will incite his wrath. So this cup has that in there. And then it also has the end of unclean things. Unclean meaning ritualistically unacceptable before God. So being in a gold cup, it's dressed up well. If you see someone with a gold cup, wow, they must be drinking something really great. It looks attractive, but actually what's inside is spiritual poison, in essence. So those who partake of her wine are acting in a detestable manner. And they are being detestable to God, putting them in a state where they are being further and further away from God. And the angel has already told us in chapter 17, verse 2, that with whom the kings of the earth commit acts of immorality. Then a parallel line says, and those who dwell on earth, referring to the people who were under the kings, were made drunk with the wine of her immorality, which is a metaphor for acts of committing acts of immorality. But here he's already using this metaphor were made drunk with the wine of her immorality, referring to the cup of abominations and unclean things. So this worldwide religious system is making people further and further away from God. Why is it immoral? It's immoral, and it's viewed that way because peoples should be attached to God and God alone. God, throughout the Old Testament, uses the marriage metaphor, which is the closest relationship, to communicate his relationship with his people. The Ten Commandments themselves are relationship factors. It's, okay, if I'm going to be your God, this is how we relate. You're going to have no other God before me. You're not going to make any other images. You're going to keep my Sabbath holy, and this is how you're going to treat my family. It's all very relational. Moving on to verse 5, it says, and on her forehead a name was written, which is a mystery. Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of abominations of the earth. Now, in the first century, especially in Rome, harlots had on their foreheads usually these gold plates or some kind of hats that had inscriptions of their names on them. And if you see here, this is a stone from a street in ancient Ephesus around this time. And what this is saying, what this is communicating is, if you're looking for love, make a left turn now for prostitutes. It is an advertisement for a brothel. But the reason why I'm showing you this is, if you look at the picture of the prostitute, you can see she has this crown or tiara on, and it could be something like this that he's referring to that would have her name right there on her forehead. And this text is saying that the name that was written on here was a mystery. And mystery, we're not talking about a novel or Scooby-Doo. We're talking that it's something that's partially revealed but not really understood. So here, it's saying that it's the meaning of it is not obvious at first sight. You need extra biblical information. You need an angelic or heavenly source to help you understand it. So And that's what actually happens in verse 6. John greatly wonders. He doesn't quite understand that. And what's the name? The name is Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. It shows that that title itself doesn't equate straight over into reality. It's not just as simple as that. So it's Babylon the Great, very successful, powerful. We've seen this in her clothing and her adornment. But she's also called here the mother of harlots, which signifies that she is a city or nation or system that started, and she's producing other cities, nations, devoted to the same things that she is. They are replicating these abominations, which are detestable, and thus is implied are also they're unclean throughout the world, because it says it's abominations of the earth. So it's not something that's just connected to one country. This is worldwide. So she's a religious center from which other religious gatherings have spread. Moving on to verse 6, it says, "And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. When I saw her, I wondered greatly." So here this woman is metaphorically shown to be drinking in the blood of the saints. It pictures being drunk on their blood. It pictures a great joy of slaughtering entire families as well as opposing armies. It's a metaphor that's used in ancient cultures. And the blood, there's an obvious association with the redness of blood and the redness of wine. This is part of her cup that she's drinking and that she's enjoying. And notice, it's not just a persecution of Christians. It's their blood. It's an execution. And the witnesses of Jesus. Those are two different groups, but John is seeing and explaining it in a more detailed fashion. The blood of the saints, but her goal is to wipe out the witness of Jesus, the testimony of Jesus. Those of us, Christians, who are on the earth, who actually have the truth, have the words of life, the gospel, who can help people, she wants those people destroyed, those voices silenced. And this is why the harlot is not Rome. A lot of people think that this is possibly that it's Rome, but John is living there. And he actually lived through the great persecution of Nero, which killed a lot of Christians brutally. And yet he wonders greatly. He doesn't make the automatic association. He wonders. The word for wondering greatly is actually, I wondered with wonder that was great in Greek. It's very emphatic. It's extraordinary. The word means extraordinarily impressed or disturbed by something. And here, it's not impressed. He's not being impressed. He's being disturbed. So this vision, he doesn't understand. Why? Why doesn't he understand it? Well, remember what the angel said. Come here and I'll show you a judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters. Has John seen a judgment? No. All he's seen is this harlot who is well-dressed and well-adorned and having a worldwide influence. That seems like wealth, power, and success, not a judgment. And then in verse 3, I saw the woman sitting on the scarlet beast, full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. Now, he's already seen that this beast is blasphemous, being a false religion in himself, because the Antichrist claims to be Christ. But yet, she is also a religious system. So how does that work together? How is she riding on and dwelling or living in the beast? How are they connected yet distinct? And yet she's doing these horrible things to Christians. In our current state of the world, who is the harlot? Who is Babylon the Great? It's an image of a worldwide false religion. It's distinct from the Antichrist. It's violent against Christians. Not just violent, but executing Christians, those who stand for Christ and who will not bow to her wishes or bow and worship her. And it's centered around Babylon, the Middle East. Putting those things together, this is Islam. And what it's going to become in the end times. So let's look now, and that's the greatest, the most plausible, reasonable interpretation, giving our world as it is today. If Christ doesn't come for another 1,000 years and things change, things could change. But as we stand now, if Christ is coming back with anytime soon, that's the only group of a religious system that's worldwide that is killing Christians that would fit. And we'll see in chapter 18 how this is even greater, more so the case, not just Christians, but people throughout the world. So now let's look at the third part, which is the interpretation of the vision of the great harlot.